Welcome back. This morning we're going to continue our journey looking at the minor prophets, the book of the 12. We're almost done with this short little series. We've got 4 more to go. This morning we're looking at the little book of Zephaniah. So you want to go ahead and find your way there, go ahead and do so right now. Zephaniah is an unusual book, as are all the minor prophets really, but unusual for its own unique characteristics and traits. Zephaniah, for example, gives us 4 generations of genealogy to tell us who he is and where he's from. In fact, he can trace his roots all the way back to King Hezekiah, discussed so much in depth in the book of Isaiah. He's going to serve under King Josiah, one of 2 of the 3 good kings in the southern kingdom of Judah. The time period that the book is written is somewhere around the year 630 BC. Northern kingdom has been long ago taken into captivity. The southern kingdom is heading that way within about 40 years or so. Now, when he writes, there have been 57 years consecutively, back to back, of evilness under King Manasseh and then under King Amon. They'd worship pagan gods. They'd reinstituted the worship in high places. Things are spiritually a disaster in the southern kingdom. Now, they're about to turn around because under King Josiah, there will be a brief revival that will last during the reign of Josiah. And so Zephaniah, in many ways, is sent by God to prepare the people's hearts for this revival that's about to come on them. To do so, he warns them with what is sometimes referred to as a Jeremiad, referencing the prophet Jeremiah. He warns them with the Jeremiad, telling them, warning them, giving them harbingers of doom, that the day of the Lord is coming. Now remember, the day of the Lord in the Old Testament has 2 possible meanings. One, it could be a warning about coming judgment and doom and gloom. Or it could be a warning, or maybe not a warning, maybe I should better say a promise of good times, the day when the judgment comes, but God will rescue his people, that he'll honor his covenant promises. And so depending on your situation, your relationship with God determines the meaning of the day of the Lord for you. But in light of Manasseh and Ammon's reign, this day of the Lord discussion in the book of Zephaniah is nothing but warnings, at least at the beginning of the book. But as you read through the book, you're going to notice there's always this tinge of judgment and wrath on one side and promise of hope and rescue on the other. Let's start by reading chapter 1, verses 14 through the end of the chapter. The great day of the Lord is near and hastening fast. The sound of the day of the Lord is bitter. The mighty man cries aloud there. A day of wrath is that day, a day of distress and anguish, a day of ruin and devastation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of trumpet blast and battle cry against the fortified cities and against the lofty battlements. I will bring distress on mankind, so that they shall walk like the blind, because they have sinned against the Lord. Their blood shall be poured out like dust, their flesh like dung. Neither their silver nor their gold shall be able to deliver them on the day of the wrath of the Lord. In the fire of his jealousy, all the earth shall be consumed. For a full and sudden end he will make of all the inhabitants of the earth. Not exactly a feel-good way to begin the letter. If we would continue on through chapter 2, you sense more and more of the same, but I want to turn our attention and focus for a few moments on chapter 3 as he begins to wrap up this short little book. All the messages of the day of the Lord are found there as well. So look at chapter 3. We won't read all of it for the sake of time, but you can tell from verse 1 what's coming. Woe to her who is rebellious and defiled, the oppressing city. She listens to no voice. She accepts no correction. She does not trust in the Lord. She does not draw near to her God. And from there, all the way down through verse 8, Zephaniah warns of the coming judgment and that this judgment is going to be for all people. The time is coming, it's inevitable, and it's going to be terrible. And so he warns them that this judgment is going to be universal. He talks about God going to judge Israel, warns them of the oppressing city, as I read there in verse 1. That's Jerusalem, where they're taking advantage of God's people. Verse 2 points out part of their sin and that they're ignoring God's word, they're ignoring his warnings, his ways. Verse 3 says that they've been led by immoral people, leaders who are like roaring lions, and judges who are meant to protect the people. He says they're like evening wolves looking for easy prey. They've been guided, verse 4 says, by false prophets, fickle and treacherous men, the biblical text says, who profane what is holy In other words, they're calling what is evil good and what is good evil. And then as they're doing all this, he says in verse 5, in spite of the fact that God has been good and holy. Look at verse 5. The Lord within her is righteous. He does no injustice. Every morning he shows forth his justice. Each dawn he does not fail, but the unjust knows no shame. And so for their sinful rebellion, they're going to suffer for it. In fact, verses 6 through 8 promise that he will judge the nations, that they won't be able to plead ignorance. Ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is dangerous. Ignorance is spiritual stupidity. And for that reason, he says in verse 6, I have cut off the nations. It's already done. Even though the judgment day has not come yet, it's as good as done. I've already cut them off. Their fate is sealed. And so rather than turning to God, all they do is they turn to greater and greater evil, verse 7 tells us. So God's holiness, his perfect righteousness, demands that he must deal with them. And so deal with them he will. Therefore, he says, wait for me in verse 8. For the day when I rise up to seize the prey. For my decision is to gather nations, to assemble kingdoms, to pour out on them my indignation, all my burning anger. For in the fire of my jealousy, all the earth will be consumed. If we ended the book there, it'd be very negative and devastating. But the next part of Zephaniah chapter 3 actually says that while there is judgment for all, there's also hope for all. Now, they've already been called to repent back in chapter 2, verse 3, where he had told them to seek the Lord. But we know, of course, only those who are humble will do so, who do his just commands. They're told to seek righteousness, this right standing before God. They're told to seek humility, recognize their humanity, recognize his deity, and put themselves in a proper understanding of God. And he says that's their only hope. They actually didn't learn that, thus the warnings of chapter 3. But now back to the promise of hope here in chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 9 says, there will be a time when things will change. Verse 9, for at that time I will change the speech of all the peoples to a pure speech, that all of them may call upon the name of the Lord and serve him with one accord. God is going to change them. This is a picture of the new birth, of regeneration, of being born again. It's like God did to Lydia in Acts chapter 16, verse 14, where he opened her heart so that she could believe. Verse 10 takes us one step further and says that God's going to do this, and he's going to draw the nations that have been scattered, bring them drawn back together. This is the reverse of the curse of Babel, isn't it? Where God scattered them because of the rebellion. Now in the new day, when the day of the Lord comes, in salvation terms, he'll bring the people together. And doing so, he'll give them new hearts. He'll make them pure. They'll no longer be embarrassed by their deeds, verse 11. They're going to be humbled, verse 12. And they're going to be purified, verse 13. Their actions will be pure. There'll be no injustice. Their words will be pure. They'll speak no lies. And God will give them peace with him. Remember the language of Psalm 23, where they will graze and lie down, and none shall make them afraid. And so there is this message of hope when God will bring people to life, when he will give them spiritual renewal. What's the answer to all that? How's that all going to take place? That's really the end of Zephaniah chapter 3. That's the coming of the Messiah. Verse 14, he says, sing aloud, O daughter Zion, shout, O Israel, rejoice with all your heart. And so here's this moment of excitement coming, something to rejoice about, something to shout about, something to exult in. What is it? It's the coming of the Messiah. Look at verse 15. The Lord has taken away the judgments against you. He's cleared away your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst, God with us, Emmanuel, and you shall never again fear evil. It gets better than that as he continues on. He repeats that promise again in verse 17. The Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save. He will rejoice over you with gladness, and he will quiet you by his love. Think of that language there. What a beautiful picture. We often talk about we rejoice over our sadness. We talk about, have joy always, Paul tells the Philippians. But here's this picture that God is going to rejoice over us, that God will rejoice over his people in salvation. What a great picture of his love and promises to us. And of course, what's our only possible response? That's worship. We're going to rejoice and exult with all of our heart. Remember verse 14 said, he's going to rejoice over us. We're going to rejoice over him. In the process, he's going to deal with our enemies, and he's going to bring us great peace. course, the ultimate enemy is death. The ultimate enemy is sin that leads to death and judgment. And so this morning, he lays before us, as Moses would have said in the book of Deuteronomy, two choices: life or death, righteousness or unrighteousness. Which will it be? Will you follow the Lord and rejoice in the Lord always and have him rejoice over you? Or will you face the day of the Lord on your own, facing certain eternal damnation? Choice is yours. Which one's it going to be?